group of people, and indeed they were driven off the streets. I've met people in Syria who were in those protest movements, and as soon as they realised what was happening and that there was an Islamist insurrection, they went back, if not to the government, to the army. And interestingly, you can see the roots of that too, because there was and is a political opposition in Syria. And the most unified statement they ever made was something called the Damascus Declaration in 2005. And they had a whole lot of criticisms of the government, things they want changed, particularly corruption, particularly nepotism through the one-party state, which is really, the current president has actually half dismantled that to this day. Things they wanted changed in the government. But what they all agreed on at that time, nominally, was they didn't believe in attacking the police or the security forces. They didn't believe in outside intervention to violently attack the state. They all rejected it at that time. So when you hear the media talking about the opposition in Syria, you have to remember the most unified statement they ever made was completely against political violence for their reform purposes. Actually, there was a Turkish agency at the end of 2011, after this violence had been going on for more than 6 months, that surveyed Syrian people, one of the few genuine outside surveys, and it found that over 90% were against any violent attacks and less than 5% supported them. So Father Franz and a number of others pointed out that the violence began back in March 2011, and at the beginning of 2011, after almost a year of war in Syria with that narrative going on, the UN actually had some figures on violence. They were collecting figures on body count figures. They stopped after 2012 because the conflict became too wide, and the agencies weren't really, they didn't keep a lot of their agencies in Syria. But at the end of the first year of war, there was about 5,000 dead, and half of those were security forces. So that wasn't peaceful protesters on the other side there during that time. Can we move on to this one? So the problem is then, for us as people trying to understand what's going on in other parts of the world and trying to understand this conflict, and then indeed there are consequences of that, because in 2012 the Australian government and the Labor government actually imposed sanctions on Syria, which is still there. There are very severe economic sanctions on Syria now. People are suffering because of those sanctions. You remember with Iraq, there were sanctions all through the 90s. It was said that hundreds of thousands of children had died because over a period of time you've got the degradation of a whole lot of facilities, hospitals and so on with those sanctions. The finance system is frozen effectively. You can't get a credit card to work at all in Syria these days. You have to take cash in there. Everything is being locked down because the Europeans and the US, and to a lesser extent ourselves, also have imposed those sanctions. So based on this sort of information, our government has imposed sanctions on Syria. So if you look at the BBC, and interestingly, I've found that the Western liberal media, as opposed to the conservative media, you normally expect the conservative media to support the government of their country. The liberal media you expect to be a little more critical, perhaps. They have been more enthusiastic about this war than the conservative media. I'm talking about the UK Guardian, the New York Times, a lot of these sorts of channels. Somehow, it seems to me a sort of a colonial type of thing that they say, we're going to go and solve the problems of these people. We're not causing the problems of these people, we're going to solve the problems of these people, and that includes a humanitarian intervention, as in Libya, what they did in Libya they wanted to do in Syria, or rescuing people from their own government. So there's a series of statements from a range of Western media. I've given an example here of the BBC, and some of this sort of thing is in this book, basically. I won't go through the detail of it. A couple of chapters, again, I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but one of the things that really motivated me to write this book was I was looking at some of these particular massacres, civilian massacres, or the chemical weapons incident, and saying, what really happened here? Why was it, for example, when the Islamist groups had used chemical weapons in Syria in 2013, the Syrian government invited UN inspectors to come and look at that site in Aleppo, where fighting is going on right now at the moment, in Khan al-Assal. And when those UN inspectors, invited by the government, came to Damascus, all of a sudden there was a chemical weapon incident in Damascus itself, and it was blamed on the government. What possible motive would a Syrian government have to do that when they'd invited chemical weapons inspectors there to look at what the Islamist groups had been doing? And yet, because there was so little critical scrutiny in the media, most of the media have gone along with that. They've written this false history. You'll see journalists now repeating this stuff endlessly. President Assad gassed his own people, gassed children in the Ghouta, in the East Ghouta, the countryside just to the east of Damascus there. Completely false. And the evidence is there. You can go back and track it back and find it. And that's why that table represents the shaded areas, what the official story is relying on. The rest of it is, from US scientists, from US intelligence, from Syrian Christian groups, a whole range of them. This was not from the government at all. It came from Jabhat al-Nusra, the official Al-Qaeda in Syria, and Jaish al-Islam, one of the groups they call the moderate rebels that are now massacring people in Aleppo. So if you want to have a look at the evidence is there, and we've had 5 years of war. You can track back and find this. There were journalists from Jordan. There was a Syrian Christian group organised by a Mother Superior of a convent. There were US scientists who looked at these sorts of things, but that's not reflected in our media today. Can we go on to the next one? On top of that, if you say, and a lot of people do say, that, this is in the Syrian media, or this is in the Russian media, or this is in the Iranian media, or the Latin American media, we won't listen to any of that. I say you have to, really, if you want to understand another country, you have to go and listen a little bit to what those people are saying. Even if you don't understand Arabic, you have to try and find out ways to see what other people are saying about these sorts of things. But because we Western people are a little bit focused on our own institutions, I say, let's go and have a look at the emissions. What have they admitted doing themselves? Now, the latest pretext for Australian troops, Air Force, as well as US troops and British troops being in Iraq and encroaching into Syria, is that supposedly there's some new war against this extremist group called ISIS. Well, Al-Qaeda yesterday, they're a branch of Al-Qaeda, basically, that sort of ideology. The Wahhabi ideology from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some of the other Gulf states. 2 years ago, for their own reasons, a group of very senior US officials said, oh yes, it's true, our allies are financing these groups. All of them. The moderate ones, the extreme ones, including ISIS, including Jabhat al-Nusra. Who were they? The US Vice President, the head of the US military, Martin Dempsey, and the chair of the US Congressional Committee on the Armed Forces, Lindsey Graham. What did Joe Biden say, the US Vice President? They were trying to get rid of Assad. We know they're trying to overthrow the Syrian government. So notice he's not saying we, he's not saying Washington's doing this, and the Saudis, Turkey, which is a member of NATO, remember, Qatar, some of the other Gulf states, he mentioned the United Arab Emirates as well. They, the initial ones they set up, the so-called Free Syrian Army, it wasn't really an army, it was a way to send arms and finance to lots of little groups, were trying to get rid of Assad. They couldn't do it. So they were throwing money and tons of weapons at anyone who would do it, including all of these extremist groups, Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. And his fallback position is, we tried to persuade them not to do it. Well, it's a little bit facile, isn't it, really? In Washington, there's a specific office that says you can't re-export US weapons. If you buy US weapons, you have to get a certification to re-export them to someone else. You can't give thousands of tons of weapons to someone else having bought them from us. They police that sort of stuff unless they don't want to. So there's not really the possibility that Saudi Arabia, which is financing most of this, of course, and buying the weapons from Britain and France and the US for these purposes, can just give them out to these extremist groups without a green light from the people they bought them from. I was in Palmyra last month, actually. I went to Palmyra just by coincidence. I was talking about this book in Damascus, and they said, we've just liberated the city from ISIS. The US played no role in it. That historic city with the ancient, the kilometre-long street with columns and the temples that ISIS had destroyed, and they'd chopped the faces and the heads off a lot of the statues, thousands of year old heritage and so on. And all of the weapons used to take over that city by ISIS last year were American weapons and Israeli ammunition. American weapons. And they were lying on the ground. I picked one up and I said to a Syrian soldier, "Is this one of yours?" Heavy caliber. Look, no, it's one of these, basically. But they use Russian weapons, the Syrians. So they took it over with US weapons. They had Kevlar body armour, like more sophisticated weapons than the Syrians themselves have, basically. The Syrians at great cost. Like when they lost Palmyra, the Syrian soldiers, I think about 220 were killed. And when they took it back, they lost another 150 young men taking it back too. And they're still fighting those groups. But they all use American weapons. And from the American side, you've got this story. Well, okay, they've taken them from the Iraqi army. Yeah, okay, they've taken the Iraqi army. We've dropped weapons and by mistake they've landed with them. Okay, by mistake they've landed with them. We've given weapons to the moderate rebels and the moderate rebels have defected to ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
True. But, there's a money trail there and,
Right.
they're following the money trail.
Well,
Whatever, they've got the anti-tank weapons, they've got Hummer vehicles, they've got a lot of American weapons there, basically. That's what's been used in Syria.
All the way to New York.
And the senior officials admit that their allies are doing it, but what allies are doing, there was an old phrase you might have heard from the CIA, plausible deniability. You keep an arm's length, keep the violence at arm's length, and pretend that they're doing something a little bit independent. Can we move on this one? So there's the group of people that back the extremist groups, and it's true, for the most part, you don't find evidence of the US directly supporting them, except if you read the Iraqi papers. If you read the Iraqi papers, there are at least half a dozen senior Iraqi officials who say, no, they're airlifting stuff in, they're taking commanders out when they're under threat, there's a direct relationship going on there. But who reads the Iraqi media? It's Iraq, after all. People don't pay attention to that sort of stuff. But these are the people that have been suffering this the longest in this period of time. For the most part, the direct links are through Saudi Arabia, Qatar, a couple of the other Gulf states, Kuwait and the Emirates, and Turkey, which has that very long 800-kilometre border with Syria, which is an open vessel for all of the jihadists coming from. The Syrians calculate there's more than 80 countries that send people in there. A lot of them come from France. The biggest group of jihadists going into Syria are from France. You've got Belgium, you've got Britain, you've got a whole range of countries that are sending these people into Syria. Israel covertly, because everyone in the region hates Israel, so they keep a low profile, but they are also have been openly promoting the fact that they're doing humanitarian assistance to the rebels in their hospitals of northern Israel and coming back out with weapons and so on. So that's the ugly truth. Someone said to me the other day, an academic, he says, no one's got any problem talking about the atrocities of these extremist groups. What they've got a problem with is saying that there are strong Western links with these extremist groups, using them for their own ends. That's why the media, the Australian media, doesn't interview me. I'm an academic who's probably published more about the Syrian war in the last few years, but they blacklist me effectively. Could we move on? So here's the anti-government forces, what they sometimes call the moderate rebels, which include enormous amounts of foreigners. The most experienced are the Chechens, who were involved in an Islamist insurrection in Russia, which the Russian president eventually resolved to a fair degree.
He put it down. He put it down.
He put it down, yeah, but politically and militarily, cleverly, because that had gone on most of the 90s. You remember there was a terrible war going on there. The Free Syrian Army. Here's the former US ambassador in Damascus, Robert Ford. Here's one of the former commanders of the Free Syrian Army. That's their flag. That's the old French Mandate flag in Syria. And there's this same guy with an ISIS commander in Manag Air Base in Iraq when they fought together to take Manag Air Base in Aleppo from the Syrian army. The Syrians have got it back now, but you see the levels of separation between the US government representative and ISIS there. This is in 2013. Here you see the Free Syrian Army flag and the ISIS flag together in functions. It's true they do squabble. Sectarians don't like each other often. I thought had a student from Afghanistan. I said at one stage that Salafism, which is really the more religious term of Wahhabism, basically, that extremist type of religion of our ancestors, which is anti-unbelievers and so on, that sort of Salafism, which comes out of the Gulf, was also something that the Pakistani extremists subscribed to, and he said, oh, no. Well, the Taliban in Afghanistan said, no, they're Deobandis. The Deobandis from South Asia had, to the outsider, they look like the same sort of ideology, but it's not, and they hate each other, basically. Those are sectarians hate each other, basically. Mm-hmm. But somehow their sponsors skillfully put them together, because they have indeed recruited people from Pakistan and South Asia. Now, here's some of the moderate rebels there. You can see the ideology they have is the same extremism as those Wahhabis. They believe in, their slogans are genocidal slogans, in particular against the moderate Muslims, the Alawis, the Shia, and the Christians. Let's read that again. Here's one of the Lama Nahas, who says, the more minorities get arrogance in Syria, the more I'm certain they must be burned, cancelling from existence. And may mercy be on the spirit of Hitler, who burnt the Jews, and Sultan Muhammad, who annihilated the Armenians. So she's got a genocidal type of ideology there. And another guy here talking about exterminating the Nusayri, which is their way of talking about the Alawis and the Christian villages, is more important than liberating the Syrian capital. So that sort of extremism is in the groups that they're calling the moderate rebels these days. And there's a range of the Syrian militia within Syria itself, before we talk about the allies, the external allies. Syria is this huge mix of different things. And in the militia there, you've got people from all of the different religious communities, Palestinians, communists, a whole range of different groups, but most of them nationalists, Syrian nationalists, who are supporting the army. There's the army insignia, and the defence force, like the volunteer militia defending Syria, and some Kurdish groups, and these bunch of different types of groups. So there, within Syria, there's a big mobilisation of people. There's a huge mobilisation. You know, the army has lost something around 100,000 people, mostly young men, in the last 5 years. Of the 300,000 or 400,000 have been killed, there's something like around 100,000 of those are Syrian soldiers. So every family's lost something. This is a country the same size as Australia, 23 million people. You know, they've had 4 million people pushed outside the country, another 6.5 million displaced internally, mainly to the big western cities. So those cities have doubled in size, some of them. Latakia on the coast, Sueda in the south, doubled in size with that huge internal displacement of people from the war. And there's the international lineup now. And this has only happened because of the war over 5 years. There's something that's called the 4+1, and I suggest it's really a 4+2. What it means is, what are the groups that are resisting the NATO, and really the best shorthand way of talking about the forces trying to overthrow the Syrian government are NATO and the Gulf Council cooperation. So you've got the NATO states led by the US, but the frontline one is Turkey. The Gulf Cooperation Council led by Saudi Arabia with Qatar and some of the others. And remember, they've got media too. Qatar is the owner of Al Jazeera, Saudi Arabia, Al Arabiya, so they've got that type of weapons in the propaganda war, let's say. On the Syrian side, a war helps an army get stronger in many ways. I said almost 100,000 soldiers have died. But I would say now, despite all of that the Syrian army is actually far more experienced, far more resourceful than it was 5 years ago, basically, despite that terrible loss. Iran has always been a strong ally of Syria, despite the fact that Iran is an Islamic state, but a Shia Islamic state, so it's very against this sort of Wahhabism, which is against minorities such as Shia. Iran is unique in that sort of way, that it's a majority Shia in a country where a minority of Shia are, a majority of Muslims are not Shia. Iraq, which I said the point I wanted to make there was that Syria as a pluralist state, well, they call it secular, but my interpretation of that is, we think of secular a bit more as non-religious, but really it means pluralist in that sense, that they like the fact that there's a plurality of religions and groups and so on there. Allied with Iran, which is a religious state, but a religious state which has a very different approach to the region to Saudi Arabia. Effectively, they kicked the US out in 1979, and all of this foment about Shia-Sunni conflict has emerged since then through the agency of those Gulf states largely. Iraq, which is also was and still is to a fair degree a secular state, that is, say, it's not a religious state, but it's a federation with some tensions that have been built in there to try and use the Kurds as a chip for weakening Baghdad, let's say. Russia, which has always been a strong ally of Syria, but only really got involved militarily directly, just with their air power, in September last year. So for the last 7 or 8 months. Now, that's interesting because some people say, well, is there a parallel here with the Soviets going into Afghanistan? You know, what sort of dangers are there with that sort of entry? But I think you'll find that the entry of Mr. Putin in this way after 4 years, in other words, after Syria had resisted for 4 years, and the Russians were backing them up logistically, is rather different because they're only in the air. They're not really losing many people. There's a very strong ground force which is going in behind the air war that's there. The Lebanese resistance Hezbollah, which is listed as a terrorist group in the US, it's not listed as a terrorist group here. Its foreign military arm is, but really Hezbollah has been a resistance to Israel. They're the ones, the front line against Israel in the south of Lebanon there, and they have been key supporters of the Palestinians, and that's why Israel has been so hostile to Hezbollah, Syria and Iran, because they have effectively supported the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance itself is split. There are some that have joined the Islamists. Palestine itself is a very religious community. They say a very large proportion of Palestinians pray 5 times a day. Most Muslims don't pray 5 times a day. But in Palestine, that level of religiosity is high. But there's a minority which is through the Hamas group in Gaza, which has flirted with, sometimes been destroyed by, sometimes joined the extremist groups in Syria. There's another group that are more nationalists that have joined the Syrian army, so you have to recognise there's a split going on there. So here's 2 non-state bodies, a very disciplined, strong group, Hezbollah, which is threatened by the same extremist groups because they're Shia Muslims and they're being targeted by the Saudi forces, basically, and the Palestinian resistance. 4 strong countries. The strength of that is why they are prevailing gradually now in Syria, even though there are tens of thousands of extremists over time that have gone into Syria, backed by NATO and the Gulf Council, basically. So that's the forces there. This is Palmyra, a picture from last month. I mean, this is one of these awful sort of things of history, isn't it? Some of the most beautiful places in the world are tainted in our minds by the terrible things that have gone on there. We couldn't get in there last month because they were doing a second round of demining there. They'd already taken out 3,000 mines. When we arrived there, they were taking busloads of journalists basically to see, you know, the site of the big battle. That's the old fortress there. We couldn't get in there because they were demining. 30 mines were detonated while we were there. Very loud explosions, very close, but they were just they were cleaning them up basically. Here, which was a nice fountain outside the old historic site, which has these pillars up saying, you know, welcome to visiting historic Palmyra, and all the tourists used to go in there. It was a big tourist site. In the middle of the fountain, they construct this wire and steel thing with their flag in wire there, and they would cut people's throats and hang them up there to drain their blood into that fountain. Mm-hmm. That was the... They left it up there to...
Kosher.
To show the horrendous things. And when you go to the museum there, then they cut the faces and the heads of the statues there.
What group was that?
That was ISIS that ran Palmyra. So the strategic thing behind this, I'm getting close to winding up, is that effectively to control this region after going into Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, the only way to effectively control any region in a big project like this is to divide people up. They have to be divided. And that's why they say it's the plan B for Iraq and the plan B for Syria. You know, I suppose that suggesting that the plan A is let's have a compliant government in Baghdad and Damascus, and then our influence will be there. And what does any big power do that for? To keep out the competitors, to keep out China, to keep out Russia, to keep out perhaps Europe if Europe gets a bit more independent from the US. But in this case, the plan was, if you look at 2007, the idea coming from one of the US magazines is that Iraq is going to be partitioned in some sort of way, Kurdistan in the north. There is already a certain deal with the Iraqi Kurds that have been trying to sell oil independently at Baghdad. In other words, as if a state government here was taking federal government powers out of its hands, more or less. Indeed, they've got a deal which involves Turkey, which is rather strange because the biggest groups of Kurds are in Turkey and they're virtually in the middle of a war with the Turkish government there. Yeah. So the Iraqi Kurds have got a different deal going on there. In Syria it's different again because the Syrians have been the Syrian government have been arming the Syrian Kurds against ISIS. So that's all rather complicated. But the US point of view is here you've got potentially Kurdistan. They've ignored Syria because it's not happening in Syria. They're talking about a Shiite section in the south of Iraq and a Sunni section. They're talking about dividing it up on sectarian grounds, which the Iraqis themselves rejected, a long time ago. Basically. That was the vision for Iraq 9 years ago. Here's the vision for Syria. Somehow you'll push all the Alawis, all the sort of more westernised Muslims over here. This is mostly desert, by the way, in any case. You'll have a Kurdish area here. You'll have a Druze area down the south. Everyone's got their own idea of how to do it. When the extremist groups went in from Lebanon, which is already sectarianised by its constitution, they went into Homs at first, which was trying to create a caliphate in that part. So the only way to try and overthrow a national a nation state which has spent a fair amount of time in Syria, for example, convincing people that you are Syrian. I made the mistake of, first time I went there 3 years ago, I said to a Syrian friend, I said, that guy over there with the handlebar moustache, you see Druze, because the Druze indeed have, big moustache. Whereas the extremist groups you'll see they have a beard with no moustache. It's a different sort of thing. But you see Druze. So my friend stupidly went over and said to this guy, my friend wants to know if you're Druze. And I went, oh God, no. Put me in. And the guy comes back to me. He was a waiter in a hotel. He came back, excuse me, sir, I don't ask you, if you're a Roman Catholic or something like that. I just say, where do you come from? Are you from Australia? And I said, guilty. Okay. But they were brought up, whatever else there was in the authoritarian system of Syrian nationalism, they were brought up to say, you're a Syrian, you're as good as anyone, you're a Syrian. Never mind your religion, you're a Syrian first. And that was put into them for decades, basically. And it's a very powerful thing. It's more than, we don't even think of saying, I say, are you Catholic or Protestant? I don't think to say those sorts of things, unless I'm at church or something. But, so, it's very difficult to break apart that sort of idea. The Syrian army itself, which hasn't fractured, they were saying at first that they would, and the extremists indeed wanted to split on sectarian lines. We'll get the Sunnis out, and we'll leave the Alawis and the Shia and the Christians isolated or whatever. That hasn't worked effectively. Most of the Syrian army is Sunni, is Muslim, but they're Syrian. They're not religious fanatics. They're supporting their country effectively. And this is what the alternative is. The alternative, which is feared by Israel and not wanted by the US, is that in place of having this fracture, you're going to have a strengthening of this axis along here, basically. Iraq, which they thought was now a weak state controlled by the US, the Centre for Intelligence Against ISIS is in Baghdad now. Of course, they're still linked into the US is still, US military is still in Baghdad, there's still all those sorts of links. There are arms contracts, there's all sorts of commercial links. It's not so easily to disentangle that stuff, what did you say, unscramble the egg after you've made the omelette. Mm-hmm. But the Centre for Intelligence that shares with Syria and Russia and Iran is in Baghdad. Why? Because they've got the same security concerns about these zombies that have been sent in to damage their countries, and they're both fighting the same sort of war there. The problem there is that Israel has always been worried about the arms support from Syria, Iran and Hezbollah to the Palestinians was in there. So there's the sort of the geostrategic lineup of things. On the one hand, balkanisation, and on the other hand, the strengthening of what's called an axis of resistance in the region. Next one, That's it. So that's what this book is about, to try and basically people who are curious and honest want to know about the current war, the current big war of our day, but at least there's some information. At first I was writing some magazine articles and I thought, well, I'm an academic, I might as well, this stuff's controversial, I might as well document it, so you can go back and check the sources, you don't have to trust my word on it. That was the point of all that. Thanks for your patience, folks. Abolish. The question is abolish. It's all about the means, more or less. And I think the reason why they demonised the Iranians was the Iranians talked about the abolition of Israel. What they meant was, we want a democratic state there. We don't want a religious state which discriminates against Palestinian people. Why not have everyone have a say in the system?
Well, Zionism's there.
That's right. So Zionism is the obstacle, basically, but of course it's got massive outside support. There's the problem. But all of the people of that region, although the extremist groups themselves are now happily taking support from Israel, but everyone has been indignant about the presence of Israel there, because it's just a slow process of ethnic cleansing of those Palestinian people who took the most of the refugees. Syria took most of the refugees from Palestine. They took 2 million from Iraq too. They've still got 500,000 Iraqis in Syria. So all of the neighbours know about the impact of Israel.
David?
Okay, a question and a comment. First, I'll ask you a question, very simple. If ISIS derives from Saudi, which you said, why then is Saudi now fighting ISIS?
Yeah. So ISIS derives from Saudi.
Yes, that's what
Saudi,
you said. That's
yes,
what you said.
That's right.
So Saudi is now fighting ISIS. That's a fact. So why is Saudi fighting ISIS?
Where are they fighting ISIS except in Saudi Arabia? Where are they fighting ISIS except in Saudi Arabia?
Propaganda war.
Yeah.
They're part of the coalition of what the US says is fighting ISIS. The US is not fighting ISIS, except in some limited respects, where, for example, they went into the Kurdish part of Iraq, and they didn't want them to upset that deal, because the Iraqi, the Kurdish Muslims are all sort of their own sort of Muslim who qualify as heretics according to Wahhabism and ISIS, basically. So you might remember some time ago that the US was bombing ISIS up in that region there. But when ISIS went into, and by the US I mean the US coalition, which includes Australia and Saudi Arabia and all the rest of them, Jordan and so on. But when they went into Palmyra, 1,600 of them across 800 kilometres of open desert, and with all the satellite technology that you has, they didn't drop a single bomb on them there. So the US and Saudi Arabia, as it's one of its key allies, are very selectively involved in this process, basically, of supposedly
You're
fighting.
saying that the US is supporting ISIS, are you?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I thought I made that clear.
Okay. Well, look, the second thing I want to say is a comment. You said, I believe, that Britain and France were defeated by Nasser in Egypt in 1956. Now, I happen to be old enough to remember that war rather intimately. And Britain and France were never defeated by Nasser. Britain and France withdrew from Egypt because of their commitments to the American alliance, because America declined to support the war, and therefore, in compliance with the alliance they had with the United States, they withdrew in good order. They were never defeated by Gamal Abdel Nasser at any time whatsoever. So get your facts right.
Well, I think you've said the same thing as me in different words, really.
Hey?
I think you've said the same thing as me in different
You
words.
said they were defeated.
Egypt took control of the Suez Canal, which is what it wanted to do.
The British and French.
Did they withdrew or
you
they
said-
defeated? I'll let people say that they withdrew. That's all right by me.
They got a ticket.
But they expected, as the Georgian guy did some time ago, that the US would come and support them, and they didn't, basically. And that's, of course, how they were not able to maintain their strategic objective. They say there's something about Israel, by the way. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, they say in the Middle East, Hezbollah defeated them. Well, they didn't actually defeat them. The Lebanese lost 1,000 people. The Israelis lost 150 or something like that. But the thing is, Israel didn't achieve its strategic objectives.
Yeah.
And that was the first time that Israel had been stopped in its tracks in that sort of way.
Well, hang on, back in
So they talk
73
about defeat in that way.
Back in 73, they got their backsides kicked.
Well, in 73, Egypt pulled out and left Syria on its own. There was the big problem of they were trying to get the land back from 67.
Yeah, but
And,
the Jews were getting a kicking.
They were, but the problem was that Egypt pulled out of it
Yeah, pity.
and did their separate deal
Then
with.
they bought the Suez Canal.
I think Jim had.
If President Assad survives the military side of the war, from your experience in Syria, what follows on from a victory of the Assadists in the war?
Politically in Syria?
Yeah, politically in Syria.
A version of what's there already, which is that it's a coalition government effectively in Syria. There's still discontent at the corruption in the Ba'athist system, but the Ba'athists still have a majority. There was congressional elections last month in Syria. I was there when it was happening. There's a slow shift there in participation of people in that, and that's going to keep going. Basically, that President Assad, for example, at the moment, I believe he lost a certain amount of popularity at the beginning of the war, not for what the West says, because the Syrians thought he was too soft. They call him Mr. Soft Heart. There was actually, because they thought his dad would have crushed this early, basically. They knew what it was about. It was the Muslim Brotherhood, and they wanted to crush it early. He has an order, there's an army order that says that they have to make all efforts to spare any Syrian lives. Not foreign terrorists, because they kill foreign terrorists. I've seen it on film. They execute foreign terrorists. But Syrians, because there's a process of reconciliation, they call it reconciliation, you can call it surrender or whatever, but there's indemnities. They've done it for over 10,000 people now. They've recruited people back there. So what it all means is that the President Assad is considerably more popular than the Ba'ath Party, but the government, he is attracting some other civil opposition groups or parties into his government. The army is even more popular than President Assad because everyone's family in the army, and they're actually defending their country, so I see a continuation of that sort of process. Obviously they're trying to reclaim, and there's a sense of the loyal opposition which supports an inclusive nation that's not sectarian, and that is against foreign intervention and terrorist groups. Now, when it comes to economic policy, all that stuff will open up rather more when things are more stable.
I don't mind getting a question. Given that Obama is definitely a sympathiser of ISIS, and he's been either not attacking them or helping them outright, if the best thing that could happen happens and Trump gets in, how will that alter the whole balance in that area?
Well, I think that on the one hand, there's sort of a sense in which Washington has a project, in the sense that Obama inherited a Bush project, which was, Bush started these wars. Obama did it in a different way, effectively, with Libya and Syria. But on the other hand, now they've got a losing proposition, and the US doesn't like to lose, and they never admit that they lose. I don't think they admitted that they've lost anywhere. Maybe the British were the same like that. But you could see, if I was a politician, I think you're probably right, I think Trump will probably win, the way things are looking. But whoever wins this election, the presidential election, there's a chance for them to distinguish themselves from the failures of their predecessors, isn't there? That's usually what happens in politics, regardless of the party, more or less. And so they're looking for a way out, I think. But on the other hand, they've got this project which is going to implode, more or less. And as I've tried to say, what's happening in Syria now, with the tide turning in favour of that 4+2, or you could say Syria, Iran, Russia, is that the grip on Iraq is going to change too, So it's a difficult pill to swallow for the US. It's going to be difficult for them they're certainly not going to admit defeat, but they want to look for some sort of way out, some sort of face-saving.
Well, the average American simply doesn't know that their treasonous government is supporting what's supposedly the enemy.
Well, you see what Obama did. Obama withdrew from the tension with Iran. Remember 5 years ago, there was going to be World War III over Iran, for whatever reason, basically. And now, it's not that Iran isn't their target anymore, it's on the back burner. All of that stuff, that deal that they did, is put it onto the back burner there, because they don't like an independent state in the middle of something that they want to control.
The average
So-
American doesn't read the Jewish news.
I don't know, they probably do. Or
I do. The New York Times, yeah.
Obviously, this is one very, very complex proxy war on behalf of not only America and Israel. What's your opinion about what the circumstances with the downing of the Russian plane by the Turkish Air Force?
Well, I think, like, when Russia got involved, they were, because Mr. Putin's a pretty clever, experienced politician by now, after all these years, was that when Russia got involved in September last year, they tried to isolate their enemy. You don't want to fight the war on several fronts, right? So he spoke to Turkey, he spoke to Qatar, he spoke to the Saudis, he spoke to Israel. He tried to say, look, we're going in on the rationale that the US has against these extremist groups, so that not confronting the US, because the US wasn't doing what they said they were doing, but it was harder for the US to confront them over that because they were, and so all of those other players, Russia, Putin tried to quarantine them more or less from the fight, including Israel, and to some extent it's worked with Israel. It collapsed with Turkey over that issue there, because of that's the most sensitive border, big long border where all of the foreign fighters were coming in through from Turkey. So the relationships obviously got worse. Then they exposed the oil trade that Erdogan's son was managing there, all of that sort of stuff. So the goodwill is all broken down there with Turkey, and that was the catalyst, that one there, more or less. But I still think the same principle applies, that no one really wants wars to escalate, and you need to have a finite objective and achieve it as quickly as possible, rather than let things drag on, basically, because it's worse for...
But if you don't want it to escalate, why did they do what they did?
Why did Turkey do that? Well, Turkey is been playing the NATO card. They're trying to say, look, you harm us and we'll call in all our NATO partners, basically. And to some degree it's worked, because at the moment Germany is playing ball with, apart from the US, Germany's playing ball with Turkey. And the whole refugee thing has been politicised to that extent that they've militarised the refugee thing there. They've made it part of NATO's strategic objectives to, ship the refugees back to Turkey, and they paid them money to do it, but at the same time Turkey has become a key player in the support of ISIS there because of that 800-kilometre border there. So that's the open sore. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous situation. Even, I think, the Syrian alliance is winning, but it doesn't mean to say the war's going to end. I still remember the Vietnam War. We all thought the Vietnam War was going to conclude in 1968. And we had another 7 years of how many more people died with that.
Can I ask a question? We have Australian troops currently training Iraqi troops. Now, what part of the Iraqi troops are they training? The ISIS one or the?
They don't know.
I don't believe that the Australian troops would have any role to play with the ISIS side of things. I'm sure that there are commanders from the US and Saudi Arabia with ISIS, but the pretext was the air power in bombing ISIS, more or less. But the thing is, in Iraq, from the point of view of there was a legal invitation from the government of Iraq for the Australian troops to be there. But there's different to Syria. The Syrian government never accepted this, and they pretend the Syrian government doesn't exist. In the Iraqi situation, though, what's happened is when the Iraqis have been making advances against ISIS too, with Iranian help. They leave the US back in Baghdad. When they went into some of those major cities, Tikrit, for example, they took Iranian support with them. They left the Israelis, the US in Baghdad, basically. So the US military still has a presence there, a strong presence there, but they believe that they're betraying them, basically, and you can't tolerate that if you're a military, basically. So I think the Australians are in the same camp. They're more or less a token presence there to give legitimacy to the US presence there. I don't believe they're very actively involved in anything hugely controversial. But they're giving that moral support to that project.
Well, if they left Hussein and Gaddafi where they were, problem solved.
A lot of people in the US are saying that now.
That's right. Yeah, come back to bottom.
Okay, let's put our hands together again. Jim is going to be speaking on soft kill, hard kill, and the rise of China over Australia. Jim's got pretty good extensive knowledge on things to do with China. We've been to several of his presentations in the past, so please welcome Dr. Jim Saline.
Great, thanks folks. It's actually interesting that there's been such a wide diversity of speakers and political opinions in many ways at the meeting today, because the subject that is being addressed will probably ultimately require in Australia a very wide united front of all sorts of different people to in fact solve. I've been asked to speak at many meetings in recent times about what I call Chinese imperialism in Australia, and I know I've spoken here about it in the past. Earlier this year I wrote a lengthy pamphlet called The True Cause of Australian Independence, which addressed not only the issue of Chinese imperialism in Australia, but the concept of Australian independence itself, which I take also to mean independence from the Washington-New York regime, which you can loosely call the United States as currently constituted. I note that an organisation, just for the sake of the argument that I have something to do with, called the Community Flag Party in Argentina, actually sponsored a forum 2 days ago called Chinese Neo-Colonialism in Argentina and Latin America. So it's not simply a subject that may concern Australians, but it's actually something that concerns many people. Have we arrived at the situation where a new superpower has emerged in the world, which is also treading off down the imperialist road? Where to begin with this? Well, once upon a time, if we go back perhaps 100 years ago, there were many people who considered imperialism to be a good thing. There were theorists of the building of empires. They said that it was something that symbolised greatness and achievement, perhaps even military prowess or national pride. And to a small extent, of course, well, there's some truth to that. There's also a counter view which arose in the victims, in many ways, of those imperialisms. If we go back in time, most of those empires that existed 100 years ago were European creations, and what's arisen in the victims, and I use the phrase there were victims, was an awareness perhaps that they were, once they achieved their national independence from the empires, that the way in which they wanted to run their societies was forever scarred by the experience of colonialism. And there's some truth to that too. I don't think it excuses inefficient states and bad results in different parts of the world, but there's some truth to that too. But it's become a little bit more complicated by the rise of a new imperialism, which I say is that of the Chinese superpower. It's an Asian power, certainly not a European one, and it arose out of the conditions that had been imposed on it by former imperialism. In Australia, over the last perhaps 50 years or so, and for the sake of convenience, there's an attitude which we'll loosely call anti-racism. I don't regard, by the way, anti-racism as the opposite to racism. Racism might be the silly idea that some group of people are better than somebody else, but anti-racism is not necessarily the opposite to that. It's an entire project. And in the discussion of anti-racism, we often find that it's very difficult to discuss, say, China's relations with Australia without the intrusion of the issue of race. Last year, during the free trade debate, the Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, accused critics of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement of, quote, xenophobia. Unlike Pauline Hanson, he knew what the word meant. Mm. He also accused the Labor Party and the trade unions and others of xenophobia because they questioned the nature of the deal that was being struck. It wasn't only Tony Abbott who said that. The issue of xenophobia has often been labelled at people who might criticise, say, Chinese property purchase in Australia. It's regarded as reactionary thinking or backward, and it's something to do with the politics of race. So therefore, if we look at
China's activities in Australia, we might also look perhaps at Australia's relationship with China, or perhaps historical Chinese migration in the past. And there were some incidents between Europeans in Australia and Chinese in Australia, such as the Lambing Flat incidents in the 1860s and other trade union struggles. But they're not necessarily the same thing when you discuss an empire, a superpower. The idea that if you're xenophobic towards a superpower is somehow or other insulting to it. How do you insult a superpower on the grounds of race? It is in fact rather absurd. In fact, I think the Chinese have 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles. If you want to insult them on the grounds of race, then unlucky. I think that the discussion of race in the subject of Chinese imperialism is not really worth having. It does have a dynamism, by the way, which I'll come to in a moment, but it's not the issue. Therefore, if Australians confront the issue of the rise of China and the establishment of China of some sort of hegemony over Australia or interest in Australia, the statements made by people who will loosely call anti-racists are not only unhelpful to it, they could actually be helpful to an intruding superpower. There are some very ominous signs in China's role in Australia. If you go back just 6 years ago to Canberra, there was an incredible incident that took place when some people who were protesting over Tibetan rights, Tibetan independence. China, of course, invaded Tibet in 1959 and occupied it. What occurred was that a number of hundreds of people, Australians supporting the Tibetan cause and ethnic Tibetans, students and others who were demonstrating, they were descended upon by 10,000 Chinese students who had been mobilised by bus throughout Australia. And bear in mind, the people who came were not Australian citizens, perhaps, of Chinese background or anything like that. These were Chinese students who were bussed into Canberra, courtesy of a millionaire who I believe funded it to the extent of $2 or $3 million to make it happen. And they intimidated into silence the Tibetan protesters. They came completely equipped with flags and banners and uniforming and megaphones and all the rest of it. It was actually an intervention in Australia's internal affairs. If some people want to demonstrate over the matter of Tibetan rights, well, that may well be their right to do so. And if the Chinese students perhaps didn't like it, then they could have organised protests at local universities and said that, you know, China was being unfairly maligned. They didn't do this. They set out to shut down a political protest. Australia, of course, did not protest to the Chinese government that this had been done. In fact, Australia acquiesced in it. But it is a political intervention in Australia's internal affairs. In April, just last month, there was an Australian Action Committee for Protecting Peace and Justice, as it calls itself, which convened a large meeting in Sydney over the matter of the South China Sea. And what they did was, most of the people at this meeting belonged to, and the exact words they used was, Australia's Chinese elite. And these people came and they issued a communique in which they said that overseas Chinese should have a clear and sober understanding of this and come together to jointly make a call for justice in response for the motherland. In other words, the representatives of a community, be they perhaps business people or migrant people, came together to stand up for Chinese rights in the South China Sea for the motherland. Now, I may differ with some people here. I never would call Britain my motherland. But in respect of the Chinese group that came and had this meeting, they actually called China the motherland and they believed that they had loyalty towards it. Overseas Chinese have been the subject in the past of quite intensive mobilisation by the Chinese state. In fact, back in the 1960s, during the break between the Soviet Union and Red China, in fact, I collected deliberately the pamphlets that the Soviet embassy used to issue. There were quite a number of them. And they pointed out that the Maoist government in Peking carried out the most elaborate and sophisticated espionage, cultural activities, building up of political movements, and so on and so forth for all the Chinese throughout Southeast Asia. The modern state, as I'll point to in a moment, actually inherited some of this. This intrusive activity, those two incidents, perhaps 6 years apart, showed that something is indeed occurring in Australia. Let's just have a look at just a few things that have happened here in the last several years that certainly put a little bit of flavour on the whole matter. China was involved in the unsolved Fitzgibbon affair. Now, this involved espionage, it involved gifts, it involved trips to China on the part of a man who was actually the Defence Minister. It also involved a couple of people who turned up later, many years later, down in Wagga Wagga in connection to a Chinese trade centre. They'd even forged documents, these two primary Chinese players, to suggest that they were in fact in some manner or other married to each other. And, well, they were married all right, but it was highly irregular what they had done. We've seen the sale of the port of Darwin to Chinese interests in circumstances when even Australia's intelligence services, whatever else I or anyone else may think of them, I don't exactly like them, but in circumstances where they themselves say that Australia's domestic security, its military security, has in fact been compromised. Amazingly too, the Chinese company which bought the port of Darwin has a security force for its protection. But this security force is, administratively speaking, actually a part of the Peking organised, of course, People's Liberation Army. So your security men who guard the gates or guard your personnel, in a sense, are part of a foreign military force. This is spooky stuff. It's in fact, I suppose, scary stuff. On another level, and a cynical one, there's our former Prime Minister Bob Hawke. His personal wealth now, I believe, is $370 million. It's no secret that Prime Minister Hawke has travelled to China almost 100 times since he left office in 1993. Prime Minister Hawke specialises in the sale of Australian property. He uses his connections, such as they were and are, to facilitate those arrangements. When you get a situation like this, of these different types of interference in your affairs, you have to ask the question, well, quite obviously, what is all this? How does it operate? Chinese imperialism, okay, an interesting subject. Where does it come from? The theory of imperialism itself, I think, should also be very, very closely looked at. We know that imperialism, as I said before, some people see the positive sides of the old imperialisms, pride and assertion and achievement, and as I said, there's some truth. All empires begin that way. Most of them end as squalid exercises. That's a sad reality of human life. But imperialism involves certainly imperatives of geopolitics, ethnic struggles, nationalist fervours. Those things are certainly present in the rise of the Chinese imperialism, and they're there right now. But there's also an economic side to imperialism, and that's the thing that I actually want to talk about. The theory of imperialism that we're generally familiar with, and it's crept into just about all of the literature, and I'm familiar with the literature for a multitude of reasons, began with an English writer, J.A. Hobson, around the turn of the last century. And his ideas were actually then lifted and taken over by Lenin. From Lenin, there's been a plethora of writers ever since who followed the basic precepts of what Hobson set down, what Lenin set down. Doesn't make it wrong. In fact, I hate to say it, but it's extremely correct. What they said was that imperialism arises when you get large corporations that monopolise the economy. You get the rise of finance capital over the top of those corporations. These corporations then expand throughout the world, dividing the markets between themselves and indeed competing with each other sometimes over those markets. Capital is also exported from the country that's become an empire into other areas. And then lastly, and the devil in the detail, the imperialist countries squabble with each other to divide and redivide the world over and over again. The model, unfortunately, fits. Right now, China does just about all of these things. Imperialist countries not only penetrate other countries, they strengthen their armed forces to achieve their spheres of influence. The progress of China since 1976, the time of the death of Mao Zedong, that's 4 decades, that's all. The replacement of the old socialism by some type of state capitalism has been truly amazing. But China drew on a number of things. It was already a country in the process of modernisation. It was already a country with a highly intelligent and literate people. It was also a country that had some sort of industrial base and focus in the world. Unlike, say, Japan, which had a constitutional revolution in 1867 that then spurred Japan down the road. It took Japan 60 years to really become a world power in Asia, something they'd sort of achieved during the First World War and had definitely achieved by the 1920s. China's done this in 40 years and on a much greater extent and reach of its power. There's always a continuity, of course, between what was and what is. Students of history, and you've certainly heard a couple of students of history here today, look at things like geopolitics and culture, and they point to the continuity of states that occupy areas or have interests. In other words, communism was a definite reality that succeeded upon Tsarism, but it was still that huge expanse of territory across Siberia and Europe. It still followed certain patterns of logic, even if it had become a revolutionary state. China, ditto. China, the fact that it had gone through its socialist period, its Maoist period, didn't mean to say that it didn't have the same ambitions of national unity and imperial expansion that the former emperors of China had had. And certainly today, those who rule China may well have the same ideas and visions that, say, Chairman Mao had. And indeed, I'd say that that's inevitable. In fact, Mao Zedong not only looked towards the expansion of China to its natural borders, he looked beyond China's natural borders. All of the mythologies that you've often heard over the years of the Indonesians, you know, publishing maps and there's Australia and they call it South Aryan and all that, that's all certainly true. But the Chinese have their own versions of this. And they claim vast stretches of China, of not simply the territory of China to be integrated, but they claim vast tracts throughout Asia and Siberia and so forth. And children have been raised in this type of propaganda. But it's not simply seizing the territory, it's taking the spheres of influence, exercising what's called hegemony over these places. The China of the capitalist road that took on after the death of Mao Zedong inherited all of these goals. And in fact, I'd say to you, if anything, they're better at it than Mao Zedong ever was. If I do not, by the way, consider contemporary China to be any sort of communist state. It just isn't. What we've actually seen is that vast amounts of Chinese state wealth have found their way into the hands of billionaires. If China was, colloquially speaking, a Maoist state, you don't have billionaires. You just don't. But there they are. So whatever's going on in China, whether they call themselves the Party of Fu Manchu or the Communist Party of China, the bottom line is that it's some sort of, if you want to understand it, state capitalism, but also allowing vast amounts of wealth to end up in the hands of private individuals. It is still a dictatorship, but it's one where vast amounts of wealth are in the hands of individuals as long as they pursue some sort of imperial goal. China, in that last 40 years, as I've often repeated, has come into the possession of a large amount of money, sometimes called the US national debt, or at least part of it. Something like, I think it is now about 3.5 to 4 trillion of the US's 11 trillion in national debt. it's always argued by me that what do you do with useless paper? Dollars is just paper. What do you do with it?
Sure.
If you dump it on the market, so to speak, you precipitate universal crisis. So you don't want to do that. The old saying, as I said to someone here today, if I owe you $100, I'm in trouble, but if I owe you $10,000, you're in trouble.
That's right.
And this is exactly right. Someone owes Red China $4 trillion. The Chinese are in trouble. To make that work, you've got to find value for that useless money. And there's a number of ways you can get it, and Australia is certainly one of the places where you can come and get it. My talk today is, I suppose, about how imperialism penetrates into Australia. And I think the first thing to talk about is the soft sell of the new superpower. Just for the purposes of today, I've called it panda imperialism. All things Chinese are nice. And there are many Australians at all levels of politics and of business who actually see the rise of China as benevolent. As Robert Menzies once said of the rise